I have just an unbelievable clip here for you. CNN did a segment on Syria, and it started out somewhat tepid, but by the end, it was unabashedly pro-war. So keep your eye out for that as you watch this. And we're going to come back, and then I'm going to break it down for you.
This news conference, presumably he'll be asked, what are you going to do? What have you done? What can you do to try to stop the slaughter of these women and children, the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding, that is escalating in Syria right now? What can he say?
What he has said, I think most recently to Fareed Zakaria, is that it was the best option of a host of horrific options, and that he did not think that involving U.S. troops in any major way and entangling the United States in yet another Middle East war would have made the situation any better. I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but that has basically been his argument. There are a lot of people in the human rights community and people who are looking at what has essentially been a genocide by another name in that country. Hundreds of thousands killed, millions and millions displaced, a whole bunch of instability throughout the region now, even in Europe because of the immigration crisis that they have there, who can't imagine how anything could be a worse option than this one. But yeah, as you watch these images from Aleppo, it's just been one of the worst things that's happened in the Obama presidency, and it's going to be something that he as president is going to have to reckon with in the same way that President Clinton had to reckon with in action in Rwanda.
Yeah, I heard yesterday from Chuck Hagel, who was President Obama's defense secretary, and he said there were other options short of deploying 50,000 or 100,000 U.S. ground troops to Syria that might have prevented this humanitarian disaster, but for whatever reason, the president decided to stop short of that.
Two people have blood on their hands for what's going on in Syria: Vladimir Putin and Bashar al-Assad. Those are the two people who are mainly responsible for the bloodshed we've seen there. In terms of the blame in the United States, President Obama gets blame for his policy, which cannot be seen as a success in any way, shape, or form. But to let Congress off the hook would be doing a real disservice to history. Congress didn't have the weren't going to vote to try to impose and enforce the red line that President Obama talked about when it came to chemical weapons against his, using chemical weapons against his own people. There are not a lot of profiles in courage I see on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue when it comes to Syria either, and it's very easy for members of Congress to beat their chests and talk about President Obama's failure. I didn't see very many of them. There are exceptions, but I didn't see very many of them stepping up to the plate and saying, we need to send troops and this is what we need to do and this is why we need to do it. I saw a lot of them running back for their home districts and blaming it all on President Obama from the comfort of under their desks.
By the end there, Tapper was flat out calling for intervention. I mean, when I watch this clip, I've never in my life seen a clearer example of manufacturing consent. The Noam Chomsky book, where he goes into detail and he explains how it's possibly the case that with corporate-run media in the United States, you get a media apparatus that is actually more pro-establishment and more pro-government than actual government-run media in other countries. That's a crazy idea. I know it's super counterintuitive, this idea that, well, you have state-run media in a certain place, they're obviously just going to parrot the line of the state. Well, no, he makes an argument that because of financial incentives in the U.S. with our corporate media, you actually get a picture that paints more the view of the world that the government wants than in any other country. And when I watch this, I go, holy shit. I mean, Tapper, again, is flat out calling for intervention at the end there. We're already involved in 7 different countries, including Syria. Again, I'll get to the details of that in a second as to how they're acting like Obama's done nothing. That's just not true. But we're doing 7 interventions, and our journalists are like, no profiles in courage over there in Washington. I mean, they're just sitting there. Why don't they do more? Okay, so let's rewind here. The first question Wolf Blitzer asked, what can you do to stop the humanitarian crisis in Syria? So notice the framing, right-wing framing. What can you do? What can the American government do? The built-in assumption is it's our role and we should get involved and we should intervene and we should do war and we should be the world police. And I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say I think that they really think they're arguing for humanitarian reasons. But as I'll describe in a second, they're wrong in that interpretation and that view. So what can we do to stop this crisis? Let me ask you a question. Have they ever asked that about Yemen? There's a crisis in Yemen that is worse than the crisis in Syria. You're not allowed to say that in mainstream media, but I'm saying it because it's true. In Syria, what do you have? You have a civil war going on. In Yemen, what do you have? You have Saudi Arabia with U.S. weapons massacring civilians in Yemen. 50%, what was the number? It's something ridiculous. There was a report that said like 50% of people are food insecure. They're on the brink of famine, if not outright in famine. You have the bombing of mosques, open-air markets, schools for the blind, hospitals. Saudi Arabia is massacring these people on purpose. And it's not a civil war in that case. It's not like both sides are armed and, hey, they're going at it. They are just slaughtering civilians and using cluster bombs, which are illegal under international law. They're doing it repeatedly. They're doing it with our help. Nobody is saying, oh my God, we got to do something to stop this. Quite the opposite. We're actually facilitating it. So you don't even have anybody saying, hey, let's just stop funding them. I mean, we say it, but only new media is saying it. So we arm and facilitate the massacre of civilians in Yemen, and instead of Jake Tapper saying, hey, how about we stop that? He's saying, Yemen, I don't even know what Yemen is. Well, we got to get more involved in Syria. We can save more lives if we just stop arming and backing Saudi Arabia than if we intervened militarily in Syria. And that would save lives in Yemen if we sanction Saudi Arabia, for example. But nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking about that because the government doesn't want them to talk about that. And they hired a bunch of bobbleheads who are going to parrot the government line. Not only that, we're so humanitarian crisis, Syria. No mention of Yemen, no mention of South Sudan, no mention of the Congo, no mention of Saudi Arabia beheading fucking atheists and saying all atheists are terrorists and treating women as second-class citizens and beheading people in the public square for sorcery and apostasy and drug taking. We are allies with the most brutal governments on the planet, and nobody gives a fucking word. What do you mean? It's fine. It's totally fine. When they're our ally, they can do whatever they want. Only when it's an enemy government. Ooh, Bashar Assad, he's backed by Russia and Iran. They're our enemies, so let's only focus on what he's doing wrong. And then again, I'm going to get into it more now, and you'll see why that picture is not totally true. So Tapper goes on to say, the human rights community is calling it a genocide. The human rights community has also repeatedly destroyed the rebels that you are implicitly backing right now in your rant against the government. So there was a report from Amnesty where they said, the rebels are torturing, the rebels are doing killings. In some rebel territories, they literally banned music. You weren't allowed to listen to music. But the picture you get from U.S. media is that these rebels are democracy-loving freedom fighters who are just trying to liberate the people of Syria because they care so much about human rights and altruism. That is complete and utter bullshit, but CNN apparently totally drank the Kool-Aid. So if you're going to bring up, hey, human rights groups are saying the Assad government committed some atrocities, you better fucking bring up that the rebels did it too, but they don't. They're only bringing it up against Assad and against Putin because that's the picture of the world the U.S. government wants you to see, so they hire people who are going to carry that line. Now, I'm not saying they're doing it as like a mohaha, we will mislead people. I'm saying they picked people who they know would fall for their propaganda and who would only go after the government and not talk about the unsavory rebels. He compares it to Rwanda. What's going on in Yemen is much closer to that than what's going on in Syria because, again, in Syria, it is a civil war. In Yemen, it is one side flat out slaughtering and massacring the other side. And then they keep insisting the U.S. did nothing, U.S. did nothing, U.S. did nothing. Well, we actually did a lot. So we gave over $1 billion to the rebels. We armed the rebels. And guess what? They immediately gave those weapons to Al-Qaeda because the rebels who we were backing were jihadists and Islamists. In fact, we covered one story. The Pentagon backed certain rebel groups, and the CIA backed other rebel groups, and then those rebel groups began fighting each other. So this idea of like, well, obviously, guys, the answer is that Washington needs to do more, and we need to intervene more. Except we've already been intervening, and it has been an unmitigated disaster. In fact, us intervening has given jihadists and Islamists more weapons and more money and more backing. Saudi Arabia and Turkey, two of our allies, are also backing rebels. And they are also backing the unsavory rebels, jihadists and Islamists. Now, Obama also recently set up a separate program to train Syrian rebels. At their peak, they had 60 people. That's all they were able to get, 60 people. And then when it really came down to it, the ones that were fighting ISIS, willing to fight ISIS and Assad, they were down to, quote, 4 or 5 moderate rebels. So we've been super duper involved, and what guys like Tapper don't acknowledge is your mythical, freedom-loving, democracy-loving rebel does not exist. There was just a story yesterday. The government was trying to evacuate civilians from an area in Aleppo. The rebels set the buses on fire. They set the buses on fire. And they spoke about chemical weapons there. The rebels used chemical weapons, and they're just blaming Assad. And then they spoke about Obama's red line. Obama backed away from the red line. Why? Because Assad turned over all of his chemical weapons. How do they leave out these basic facts? Assad even announced a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, hey, I will give every single rebel in Aleppo amnesty if you just drop your weapons. They're acting like, slaughtering civilians, and he's like Hitler, basically. Is that what Hitler said? Hey, look, I just want to let everybody know, if you drop the weapons, you get amnesty. No, and this is something, and they also blame him. Assad emptied all the prisons. That's what he did. As if it's like, oh my God, how dare he, what a monster. Why did he empty the prisons? Because the rebels demanded that. They said, we demand you empty the prisons. So he emptied the prisons, a shitload of jihadists came out, and then they went right to fight with the rebels. And the rebels were like, yes, we finally got more fighters. But then they turned around and said, can you believe Assad, he emptied the prisons? No, you told him to do it, and he did it to try to make fucking peace. So again, by the way, am I saying I'm 100% pro-Assad and what a great guy he is? That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm sure he's committed atrocities. I'm sure the Syrian army, they're no fucking angels. But what I'm saying is you have to look at all the facts, and you have to look at the reality on the ground, which is that the Syrian government, it has a secular socialist constitution. In the Syrian army, you have Sunni fighters, you have Christian fighters, you have Shia fighters. Who are the rebels? The rebels are fundamentalist Sunnis backed by Saudi freaking Arabia and Turkey. They're Salafists. They're jihadists and Islamists. So, but from Jake Tapper and Wolf Blitzer, you get this idea of, oh my God, the blood on the hands of Assad and blood on the hands of Russia. And you got nothing to say about Al-Qaeda rebels. Guys, one of the main fighting forces with the rebels is ISIS. Another main fighting force with the rebels, Al-Nusra. You're like, who the fuck's Al-Nusra? Al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda's official affiliate in Syria. And you know what they did recently? They were like, shit, everybody's onto us. We are changing our name, and since we are changing our name, we are disassociating from Al-Qaeda. Anybody buying this? I'm serious. So they rebranded, and the media in the U.S. like, they're moderate now. They're totally moderate. Moderate rebels. Moderate rebels, that's what they are. Moderate. So, Jake, you have to understand something, man. And sometimes I don't even dislike Jake Tapper. Sometimes he does a decent job covering things. But you're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing yourself right now. Wolf Blitzer, I mean, forget it. He's never had any hope. He's a robot. He's never said anything interesting, and he has no human emotions. You, on the other hand, had a shot at being a decent journalist. But you just sound like a goofball right now. You sound like you have no fucking clue what you're talking about. To anybody who actually knows what's going on in Syria, they look at you, you're like, oh my God, that's embarrassing. You basically took everything the Pentagon, the CIA, and the U.S. government said, all their talking points, which make no sense and are not based on the reality on the ground. You just fucking swallow them. You just chug it down. Oh, U.S. propaganda. Now let me spread it. So I come full circle and come back to my main point. I've never seen a clear example of Noam Chomsky manufacturing consent. The CNN is pushing only the picture of Syria that the U.S. government wants you to hear, and it is much more complicated than that, because their picture of it is misleading, biased, on the side of the rebels, and most of the rebels are Islamists and jihadists.